Also, the protests that erupted for 3 weeks, 3 consecutive weeks in the aftermath. And there was another protest a couple of days ago in which people tried to shut down the expressway there because people are still waiting for this white cop to end his vacation, his summer vacation that seems to continue on, and actually be arrested. But I also want to talk about what this means more broadly and generally for black politics in particular, but also what it means for the future of black liberation in the United States. Can black people actually be liberated from racism, inequality in the United States? And so I want to, introduce some things, and then hopefully we can talk more about them. So I begin this by saying that Ferguson had done more to focus the discussion and attention on the experiences of racism and discrimination in the U.S. than the presidency of Obama has done in 6 years. The Obama administration has been marked by a complete reluctance to engage in any meaningful discussion about racial inequality in the United States for fear of him and his administration being described as in the grip of the black community, or as being beholden to black interests. Instead of actually reaping some sort of benefit from the nation's first African-American president, since 2008, African Americans have bore the brunt of the economic crisis in the United States in any number of ways, whether it be the disproportionate number of foreclosures and evictions in black communities, the higher levels of poverty, unemployment, underemployment. 40% of low-wage workers in this country are African American. It's been borne out in terms of disproportionate rates of imprisonment and detention by the police. And throughout all of this, there has been little or next to nothing that not only the President of the United States has addressed, but institutions, organizations like the Congressional Black Caucus, which is a sort of congressional formation of black elected officials, because it's also worth saying that we are also living in a time in which there are the largest number of black elected officials in this nation's history. And so if you compare the level of elected representation versus the actual conditions and what it has meant in the lives of ordinary black people, you would have to say that there is a complete disjuncture. There's a complete disjuncture there, and that the election, these people having seats of power, being in seats of power, have actually done very little to address the conditions that are found in African American communities. In the last 2 elections, Obama has received unprecedented support from African Americans at the polls, and black people have really received next to nothing in terms of tangible policy changes. Ferguson presented yet another opportunity for the president to say something meaningful about the plight of average black people in this country, let alone actually then going ahead and doing something. And I do want to say something about what could be done. But instead of doing that, it was a typical kind of moralistic response from the president, suggesting that Ferguson offered an opportunity for, quote, dialogue and mutual understanding. And he also went out of his way, as did others, to compare people who were, quote unquote, looting to the police who had exacted violence against the people, African Americans in the community of Ferguson as well. He said actually very little before going back to and resuming his vacation at Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. But Ferguson, like Hurricane Katrina in 2005, showed that beneath all of the rhetoric about peace and prosperity as cornerstones of American democracy, it showed that there is actually a country deeply divided by class inequality and racism, making that class inequality even worse for people of color. Mike Brown was killed because he was African American, but why were the police in his neighborhood in the first place? And why did they react to him with such brutality? in part because the police always scrutinize the poor and working class more. Their crimes are easier to see because they tend to be on the street, but it is also because poor and working class communities have the potential to destabilize order and the status quo in U.S. society. And this has certainly been the case throughout African American history, particularly in the 20th century, that because of black people's overrepresentation among the ranks of the poor and working class and among the ranks of those who suffer from injustice and inequality, black people have been more willing to fight and destabilize the general order of things. And I think, that this, if you think about, this is the 50th anniversary of many things. There was a program on Philadelphia Public Radio about the 50th anniversary of a rebellion in Philadelphia in 1964. And that was just the beginning. In 1964 to 1968, more than 500,000 African Americans participated in rebellions of one sort or another across the United States because of similar conditions of inequality, racism, deprivation, and discrimination. And so that is part of the reason why black communities in particular get special or particular scrutiny. I'm going to go over,
okay.
just so you know. Get particular scrutiny from the police. But I think another reason that is of equal significance is that the political and economic system in this country really have no answers or solutions to the problems that are not just affecting African American communities, but working class and poor communities in general. On the one hand, if they did, they would have acted on them already, because you could point to rebellions in African American communities that were not race riots and that white people were going into black neighborhoods and terrorized people. That certainly did happen in the 1920s, but where black people were rebelling against conditions of racism and inequality in 1935 in Harlem, in 1942 in Detroit, in 1947 in Detroit, and then from 1964 through 1968 in more than 300 cities in the United States, black people went into rebellion over those conditions. So one would assume that if there were a solution to the problems of racism, inequality, discrimination, and injustice in the United States, that they would have been invoked at some point along the way in that 100-year or 70-year history. And so when there are no solutions for people who are living under those conditions, it gives rise to deep bitterness and rage. And part of the response to that, when you don't have any actual programmatic solutions, is to engage in repression and containment. And so this is increasingly the sort of strategy for policing in dozens of cities across the country, where young black people, particularly young black men, are hemmed into neighborhoods with few jobs, lots of poverty, and under-resourced public institutions, including schools, libraries, health clinics, and hospitals. In these same neighborhoods, a greater proportion of the resources are actually going to the police, and not with the intention of stopping crime, but with the intention of making sure that the crime that happens in those communities does not spill over into other communities. And that is particularly important when we see the processes of gentrification unfolding in different areas of the city that often pit middle class or put middle class people, white people, right up next to African American poor or working class neighborhoods. It's very important to keep crime, or the perceptions of crime, which are often carried in the bodies of black people, at bay and away from those areas that have been, that are undergoing the process of gentrification. And this approach to law enforcement in terms of repression and containment has become even more important as cities are pitted against each other to compete for resources and to attract businesses into their localities in hopes of generating revenues in ways beyond government assistance. So that as government resources, federal resources from the state have become fewer and fewer, it's been left up to cities to come up with their own sources of revenue. And that often means making your city attractive for business. And part of that attraction is driving out, driving down the tax bases, and also driving out populations that are seen as tax dependent, meaning that they use public services, essentially. And so this dynamic of cities going out to look for their own sources of revenues have made elected officials particularly sensitive about crime statistics and the appearances of disorder and chaos. And so right now, for example, I just moved here from Chicago. The mayor there, who is a pretty powerful political operative. He was the former chief of staff for Barack Obama. He is a sort of high-functioning political operative within the Democratic Party. Rahm Emanuel is also suffering his lowest poll numbers in Chicago, and polls have also shown him being beaten by various political opponents. And part of the reason for that is because there's a growing impression that Chicago is a city with an out-of-control crime problem. So at the same time, when all other public institutions in that city are being forced to incur budget cuts, it's the police that are racking up millions of dollars in overtime pay because the mayor is literally flooding the streets with police to create the appearance of fighting crime and being tough on crime. And we can also see this dynamic in New York City with the policy of stop and frisk. And according to a state senator in the midst of a hearing about a legal proceeding about the constitutional legality of stop and frisk, a state senator said that he was told personally by the former police chief of the New York City Police Department, Ray Kelly, that stop and frisk was intended to instill fear in Black and Latino men every time they left their houses. He wanted to instill this sense that you could be stopped by the police for anything, for any rhyme, for any reason, every time that you left your house, and also any time that you left your neighborhood. And so in Ferguson, you get another perspective. There's another perspective on how police are often doing any and everything than actually fighting crime. In Ferguson, citations issued by the police were the second leading source of revenue for the city. So if for whatever reason someone did not appear in court for the issue, the scofflaw crime that they were being accused of, they were charged more fees, and then a warrant was issued for their arrest, which also incurred more fees. And so in some sense, police understood that their ability to cite as many African Americans as possible in Ferguson was important to their salaries actually being paid. And so in the city of Ferguson, there was the New York Times worked out an average of 3 citations per household in a city that was 70% black, and that the mostly white city administration and mostly white city police force saw as a way of enhancing the revenue of the town was through citations in black communities. And that obviously created an inbuilt antagonism between the police and the city. And so what all these different examples have in common, I think, is that the police are not really there to deal with the issues of crime, that the issues of crime and factors that might lead into the existence of crime are never addressed or never adhered to, but the police operate more in a way to basically contain communities and to keep them hemmed in, and at different times operate in a very repressive manner, which can include public executions or choking, people to death on city sidewalks. And because this is happening in African American and Latino communities, very few Congresspeople have felt compelled to make any comments on the situation beyond the relative silence of the administration. It is true that the Obama administration dispatched Eric Holder, the Attorney General, to Ferguson, and that was a direct result of the chaotic nature of the protest. But it was also a way to try to diffuse the protest, to send a message that something was being done. But people should know that when Eric Holder was dispatched to Sanford, Florida, to investigate independently what happened to Trayvon Martin, the results of that investigation were inconclusive. Because really what it is it's a performance, it's a show to say that, the government is on the side of, the people of Ferguson or the people of Sanford, without really having to actually do much when there are concrete demands that are actually being made. Congress instead has decided to focus its attention on, the issue of the militarization of the police, which the events in Ferguson certainly highlighted. And, the militarization of the police is certainly a problem. Having armed tanks and military-grade weaponry directed at unarmed people who are engaged in peaceful protests is a bad optic, is the word that these people are using these days. And it's also, it's more generally a safe takeaway for Congresspeople to hone in on in Ferguson, because it sort of taps into a wider suspicion of police departments and their access to unprecedented numbers of weapons, which is an issue that can unite conservatives, gun advocates, militia people who are all concerned about the overreach of the state, even though none of these people had anything to say when the actual protests were happening in solidarity with African Americans. And so it's also, the spectacle of an overly armed white police force confronting black unarmed crowds of people, is just not a positive development, especially when a few weeks later the President of the United States gets on television and talks about, leading into another war in the Middle East, as I mentioned before. And this has been a recurring theme throughout the 20th century, a recurring constraint on the United States is the projections of the U.S. as a bastion of democracy, while debasing and humiliating and degrading its black population at home has always been a contradiction that the United States has had difficulty overcoming throughout the 20th and now into the 21st century. But in terms of where Congress is at, or what the political leadership of this country, where this country is at, on the larger issues that get raised by the events in Ferguson in terms of police murder and brutality, racial profiling, poverty, unemployment, so on and so forth, that there has been relative to complete silence on that. And I think, as I said before, part of that silence has to do with the lack of solutions. So within, African American communities, I think the understanding for a generation of people that perhaps there are no solutions to this leads to one type of response. In terms of the state, knowing that there is not any solution leads to, I think, a sort of heightened use of the police in political ways. And so, but what does the notion of no solutions actually mean. And I think part of what that means to me, and we can certainly talk about it in the discussion, is that trying to understand that we are living through a political period of the retrenchment, cutback, downsizing, however you want to refer to it, of the public sector, which simply means that they are willing to close schools, get rid of people's pensions, get rid of jobs completely, or simply make millions of people work for low wages with next to no benefits as a way to survive. And it's not because there is not enough money for everyone in this country to be doing better. I mean, if you think about what you have been told in various cities, I know here they shut down a bunch of public schools. In Chicago, in 2012, at the end of the school year, the city government shut down 52 public schools in one fell swoop. It was the largest school closing in the history of the United States. And so you have that picture on the one hand, and then you have last night, you have a president who seems to be saying that money is no object when it comes to chasing various terrorist groups around the Middle East. And so the issue is not, now, nor has it ever been a question of there not being enough money. It all has to do with where they want to invest the money that exists. And even beyond the state, corporations, business are hoarding their money, basically waiting to invest it based on who creates the most favorable terms for them. And those most favorable terms usually includes the destruction of unions, cut rate tax breaks, and any other factor that might contribute to their overall bottom line. And so this is sort of the program that is on offer, and that is that's largely what I mean when I talk about no solutions on their side. And so for African Americans, where the situation has been even more dire, the way in which they explain these disparities, has very little to do with the material reality in people's communities. Instead, there's a terrible narrative that has been created over the last 40 or so years that actually blames black people for the conditions that exist in black communities. The president and other black elected officials take the lead in promoting this sort of this politics of personal responsibility. They blame black parents for not being strict enough or making their kids do their homework. They blame black kids for being more interested in video games and basketball or for wearing saggy pants. They blame a lack of role models in general and a lack of morality. And they blame anyone and anything but those conditions which actually create inequality in black communities: racism, discrimination, injustice, and inequality. And so why is it that the smartest people, under any other set of circumstances, turn into blustering idiots when it comes to identifying the crises in black communities? Because to identify them would mean to acknowledge that we live in a society that after 150 years after slavery ended and 50 years since blacks in the South received formal equality before the law, that black people continue to suffer not because they don't work hard, but because we live in a society that is utterly incapable of delivering justice and real freedom to the vast majority of black people in the United States. So it's not utopic to say that we must seriously begin to discuss the need for a different kind of society based on human need as opposed to based on corporations and the rich who use them to police, who use the police and other means of repression to maintain the status quo and maintain their power. What is utopic is believing that a system that could produce the execution of Mike Brown and the hundreds of others of African Americans murdered by the police 50 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act is capable of producing freedom, equality, and justice. Because as I said before, if it could, it surely would have happened by now. Instead, black people are lectured over and over again on what personal transformations they must undertake in order to get ahead in this country. But what Ferguson also helped to crystallize in the US right now is the growing political gap between those who have lived over the last decade under the 9/11, which we're in the midst of the anniversary of, and also the economic crisis of 2008. The gap between the reality for those people and the black elected officials, really, who espouse this politics of personal responsibility from the highest level. It's highlighted the distance between civil rights leaders like Al Sharpton, who moralize and lecture young black people about how they should comport themselves, and at the same time doing very little aside from having fiery speeches that often raise good points but have very little follow through on pursuing actual programs and things that could change, that could begin to change some of the conditions in these communities. And so there are people who will cheer Sharpton when he is chastising the police, but also when he's chastising black people as well. And so there is somewhat of a contradiction there, but that isn't surprising. Black communities have been the most inundated with racist explanations to explain the large disparities that separate black life from white life in the United States. And so if you've been given a single explanation for the crises in your neighborhood for 45 consecutive years, is it no wonder that people actually begin to buy in to those explanations? But black people also know from our own experience that simply pulling up your pants, going to school on time, respecting your elders, so on and so forth, does not produce meaningful employment, health care, or relief from the relentless harassment of the police. And so neither Sharpton, Obama, or the tens of thousands of other black elected officials in this country have any meaningful solutions to the crisis that afflict black communities. Instead, oftentimes, many of them are more concerned with protecting their proximity to the first black president than actually challenging him on his lukewarm, non-existent agenda for black America. And this has meant, in real terms, quieting down calls for programs directed at job creation, particularly among black workers, meaning affirmative action, or calls for federal legislation against racial profiling, or calls for the prosecution of killer cops, not just in Ferguson, but around the country. If white cops are killing 2 black men on average a week in this country, where are the calls for the prosecution of the cops who are doing this? Let alone their invisibility, black elected officials' invisibility, largely as a political force, as they've organized themselves within the Congressional Black Caucus, as a force to end foreclosures in black communities and evictions. 40% of people most affected by evictions in the United States are African American women. And more recently, where has the elected black leadership been when it has come to the growing low-wage movement of low-wage minimum wage workers who are fighting for a $15 minimum wage? As I said before, 40% of low-wage workers in this country are African American. But if this represents the bankruptcy of former black politics, what can replace it? And this is what I want to end on. It's doubtful that a radical black politics will be fully developed outside of the development of black political struggle. And this doesn't mean that struggle will only erupt spontaneously in various places, but that you can see what that could look like coming out of Ferguson, where it was the young people in that community that took the reins of the political struggle there, and the emergence of groups like the Black Youth Project and the Dream Defenders that developed out of the struggle for Trayvon Martin in Florida. Local organizing of the variety that has responded to any number of injustices incurred in black communities has the potential to turn into more generalized national campaigns that draw broader conclusions about how to end racist abuses. There have been any number of campaigns that have had the potential over the last number of years. Ferguson is still playing itself out. The Trayvon Martin organizing, the Occupy movement, the struggles for greater black inclusion in colleges and universities, the movement against stop and frisk in New York, parents of police brutality, of victims of police brutality and police murder organizing in different cities around the country, various campaigns against evictions and illegal foreclosures, organizing against the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration, and low-wage organizing, and struggles in defense of public education, public health care, and the public sector in general, services that affect urban-based African Americans and Latinos disproportionately. These have all been the basis of lots of local organizing. And so there's an unquestionable desire to fight against the conditions of segregation, discrimination, and poverty in our cities. But there is always the question of how to make our smaller local movements larger and more effective. The black movement suffers in ways that general political organizing suffers in this country, from a lack of institutional and political continuity that connects the past with the present. The violent disavowal of the black movement at the end of the 1960s and the absorption of the remaining black radicalism and politics into the Democratic Party in the 1970s was a conscious effort to physically and politically destroy the authority and political leadership of the movements of those times. The eruption of black struggles in the 1960s, from the civil rights movement to the revolt of hundreds of thousands of African Americans and rebellions, threatened the stability of the United States. The black movement of the 1960s spawned the anti-war movement, the campus-based free speech movement, the women's movement, the gay liberation movement, and several other important movements across the 1960s. Black struggle transformed the United States in the 1960s, and that was why the repression against black Americans, African Americans, was so intense and so unrelenting. The same potential exists today for organizing, even amidst widespread unemployment and poverty and political disorganization. These factors act as a fetter on black politics, but should not be underestimated. But they should not also be overestimated. Black unemployment is dangerously high in many localities and cities, but overall, more than 65% of African Americans participate in the labor force. Black workers still participate in unions at higher rates than white workers, and well, racism is pervasive. It's not the same as it was 50 years ago or 60 years ago. And so just to end here, so we can, I wanted to end with a quote, because the reason why I was talking about the struggles in the 1960s and the post-war era is because when you put together these, there's a way in which you can put together these statistics about what is happening in black communities that can make it seem completely overwhelming, and that these are communities that are completely under siege and thus can't fight back because people are unemployed, in prison, and completely disorganized in chaos, and living in chaos. And so I think that it's important to put that into perspective, that those sorts of conditions have affected black life, certainly in the 30s, certainly in the 50s, and certainly in the 1960s. And yet still there were ways in which people were able to come together and organize and lead important political struggles that not only transformed conditions in black communities, but also inspired and helped to politically organize other disaffected groups. And so I think that that is an important perspective to keep in mind, that in spite of the hyper exploitation and oppression experienced in African American communities, that there is still such a way that black people can organize, fight, and struggle. And so to that end, I wanted to end with a quote from a black revolutionary, C.L.R. James, who is Trinidadian, but also very involved in the Black freedom struggle in the United States. Something that he wrote in 1948, which was, you know, before the civil rights movement, but certainly before the Black insurgency of the 1960s, but I think is as instructive today in terms of what the future movement could look like and the potential that it has. So I'll just end with this quote. Let us not forget that in the Negro people there sleep and are now awakening passions of a violence exceeding perhaps, as far as these things can be compared, anything among the tremendous forces that capitalism has created. Anyone who knows them, who knows their history, is able to talk to them intimately, watches them at their own theaters, watches them at their dances, watches them in their churches, reads their press with a discerning eye, must recognize that although their social force may not be able to compare with the social force of a corresponding number of organized workers, the hatred of bourgeois society and the readiness to destroy it when the opportunity should present itself rest among them to a degree greater than in any other section of the population in the United States. That we must know, and we must know that in this resolution here, behind its sober, disciplined words, there is contained a clear recognition of this immense revolutionary potential. Thank you.